Thank you for joining us for Creating and Using File Plans, a recorded web seminar delivered by the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration's National Records Management Training Program. In this session, Jeff Benson, a senior records analyst with NARA's Seattle Regional Office, introduces us to a useful records management tool, the File Plan. Let's join the seminar.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. This webinar is a part of a series of free webinars that NARA is offering to help federal agencies meet the challenges of a complex and evolving records management environment. Creating and using file plans. This webinar is a great way for program and records management staff to learn how to properly manage paper and electronic records using a file plan without ever leaving the office. This will provide a practical guide on how to create file plans. A file plan specifies how records are organized once they have been created or received, provides a finding and action guide to the records, and documents the procedures for destruction or transfer of records. This course will cover basics such as what is a file plan, what records do I need in my file plan, how do I conduct a records inventory, how do I determine how long to keep the records, and how do I implement a file plan. I would now like to introduce Jeff Benson.
Thank you, Paulette. I am Jeff Benson. I'm with the training unit at the National Archives and Records Administration. Also today, helping behind the scenes are Paulette Murray, who you just heard from, and Robin Riot, who's also doing a lot of the production behind the scenes for this session here today. We're going to talk about creating and using file plans. Again, my name is Jeff Benson, and we shall begin. So the agenda for the next half hour or so is to talk about what is a file plan, what are the ingredients. Thinking about the file plan as perhaps a recipe, what are the ingredients for that recipe. We'll talk about the steps to create that file plan. What should the file plan include? I'm going to show you some examples of some sample file plans. And again, when you do your own for your office, it's going to look a little bit different, but it's always handy to have some examples to work with. It sort of helps give you an idea of what others are doing. So it's a good benchmark. So I'm going to show you some examples. We'll talk about how does the file plan work with electronic records. I know a lot of the people listening here today deal with electronic records. That's, in fact, more and more that's becoming the majority of the types of records that we create and use. And I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about how we can use that file plan to help us manage our electronic records. And then finally, we'll talk about file plan use and maintenance. So to start off, let's just talk about what does the file plan do? What's the purpose of the file plan? Let me begin by mentioning that a file plan, from a records management point of view, from one of the tools that we can provide, one of the value-added services that we can provide to our organization as records managers, is to create a file plan. It's a very important tool. It's been a tool that's been in existence for years. It's a tool that's been around since back when we were creating everything on paper, old parchment documents. I'm sure they had file plans back then too. What is it? Basically, a file plan lists the records that are in your office. Okay, and we'll talk about how you're going to know which records those are. It describes how you should name and file the records, and we'll talk about consensus building, because again, part of what we're trying to do in records management is be standardized in terms of how we name our files, how we file them. Third bullet you see there, disposition. We want to be consistent with our disposition practices. So when a record is eligible for destruction, it's destroyed properly. The file plan will indicate the appropriate destruction date or the appropriate retention period. We'll talk about that later. Paulette, Robin, and I are from the National Archives and Records Administration. We will bring in the historic documents created by federal agencies. The file plan will also indicate at what point the record should be transferred to the National Archives for permanent retention, if it's eligible for that. And basically, in some organizations, the file plan is also used to standardize the content of case files. Examples that come to mind: Environmental Protection Agency, Superfund files. The content of what constitutes a Superfund case file is often described in a file plan. Similarly, your official personnel files, the documents on the left side of the folder, on the right side of the folder, that's also described in the file plan as well. So as you can see, the file plan is used for a lot of different things. It's a very important tool. Again, it's something that we as records managers can do that will contribute to our organization. Okay, let's talk about the ingredients of the file plan. Okay. The first thing I want to emphasize is that, especially if the person listening to the session here today is a federal employee, I think I want to emphasize first and foremost that if you are a federal employee, you work for a federal agency, the approved retention period for all of your records will be indicated on an approved records retention schedule. So no matter what agency that you work with, whether it be an EPA, whether it be Marshal Service, whatever agency that you work with, VA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, whatever agency you work with, the records retention period is going to be, for those records, is going to be indicated on the records retention schedule. Okay. So an important ingredient in the file plan is that approved retention schedule. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Your office records inventory, that's something that we will do to create before we do the file plan. We'll talk about that also. The records inventory basically tells you what records does your office hold and maintain. Okay. A big ingredient, it's the third bullet on the slide here, but a big ingredient to make sure that we understand is that the file plan that we create for the office should be a product of staff consensus. Okay. It's not something that the records manager is going to try to impose on everybody. It's a document that we're going to create using a consensus building process. Everybody will agree to a certain procedure for our records, for our files. Once we have that agreement, that's what we're going to document on the file plan. I have written quite a few file plans in my career, and I've learned that the most successful file plans that you can create are those, even though I know from an accuracy point of view what should be on the file plan, if I don't get the proper staff consensus, compliance is going to be an issue down the road. So staff consensus is very important in file plans. I want to spend a minute talking about an important term. Those of you who have been long-term records managers, you know what this term is. Those of you who are new to the records management field, this might be an entirely new term for you. The term is record series. Okay. Again, for those of you who are the old veterans, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A record series basically is a type of record. Okay. Contracts, you see the examples down below. Contracts, time and attendance, property inventories, case files. Those are examples of a record series. Record series are a functional grouping. See that first bullet there. By that we mean it's based on a particular function of your organization. If your organization is an HR organization, if the function of your particular office is to track time in attendance and leave, then your record series are going to be time in attendance, leave requests, things of that nature. Okay. That's your record series. Usually these records are filed as a group. So all time and attendance files filed together. All contracts filed together, that kind of thing. They result from the same type of activity. Time and attendance, tracking, when people leave, when people come in the morning, what days of vacation they have. That's part of a similar activity. They may document a specific type of transaction, like contract files. A lot of federal agencies, especially those in the Department of Defense environment where you're monitoring contracts, a big part of your job is to review contracts, reprove them, make comments to the contracts, whatever. That's part of what you're doing as part of your job. Okay, so your record series are probably going to be contract-related type records. Okay. An important point, again, for those of you who are new to records management, is this next bullet here. They have the same disposition authority. Okay. For those of you who are not aware in terms of how retention policy is governed in federal government, basically retention is based upon the type of record. It's based upon needs for the record for administrative, legal, and historic purposes. It's going to be a retention period assigned to all the records of a similar type. So contracts, for example, are going to have a retention period as a whole. Not individual contracts. As a whole, they're going to have a retention period. All time and attendance records are going to have the same retention period. All property inventories, similarly, same retention period. Okay. We'll talk more about that in another slide. Okay. But for our purposes to know today, for the talk about file plans, is that when we quote the disposition authority on our file plans, that disposition authority is going to be used for all of the records that are covered by that description in the file plan. So again, let's talk a little bit about, again, this is true for the federal environment. It's also true for other organizations. I'm someone personally who has worked for a number of organizations in my records career. I've worked for government, I've worked for private companies, I've worked for different levels of government, a lot of different organizations, and I can tell you that every organization that I've worked with in the past has had retention schedules. In the federal environment, as is true for other organizations, your retention schedule or record schedule is the legal authority for the transfer or destruction of records. Okay? So for those of you who are listening who are new to the records management field, it's very important that you know that we do not do any disposition of records. We do not transfer records off-site. Basically, we don't take any kind of action in terms of form of disposition or destruction of records unless it says to do so on the records retention schedule. That's where we go to get the guidance. Okay. Why it's important here to talk about with file plans, it's this legal authority, the information on the retention schedule, we're going to put onto the file plan. We're not going to create the information. We're going to take it from the retention schedule. We're going to transport it, put it onto the file plan. Okay. Record schedules, again, as I mentioned before, are based on record series. Depending on the type of record that you have, that's the retention period that you're going to follow for those records. Okay. Retention schedules take two forms. In the federal government, the National Archives and Records Administration, where we work, is basically we're in charge of retention scheduling for the entire federal government. What we see working with our customer agencies, we will see the same type of records in all of our agencies. Everybody does time and attendance. Everybody does vacation requests. Everybody does basic budgeting, financial type records, vouchers, that kind of thing. Every agency has the same type of records of a general nature. So those general administrative records found throughout federal government in all agencies are covered by the general record schedule. Okay, so those are for all records common throughout federal government. You also are going to have records that are unique to the functions of your agency. If you are with NOAA, perhaps a National Marine Fisheries, for example, there's a lot of research files you're going to be involved with. If you work for, again, EPA, Superfund cleanup, that's part of your job. These are specific to the tasks of your agency. Retention information about those are going to be found on your agency record schedules. Okay. So the takeaway from this slide, for those of you who are going to develop a file plan for your office, is to one of the first places you want to go to is your record schedules. The record schedules give you the very specific guidance, how long to keep the records, where to keep the records, and if they need to be confidentially disposed of. You'll take that information and move that over to the file plan. You will not create it from scratch. It already exists. You're just going to copy what you see on the retention schedule, put that onto the file plan. Again, we'll give you some examples later, so you'll see what I mean. Okay, here's an example of a retention schedule item that comes from the general record schedule. You'll notice here, this is a very common administrative type record, time and attendance, input record. You'll see a description, records in either paper or machine readable form used to input time and attendance data into a payroll system. You probably will recognize this. A lot of you that have an HR function, or you know people with an HR function in your office, you probably will recognize this item. The retention period, as you'll see down below, is to destroy after a GAO audit or when 6 years old, whichever is sooner. So if the records are audited by GAO and it's less than 6 years, that's fine. The records can be destroyed. If GAO does not audit your records, but they are now 6 years old, they're not going to audit them after 6 years, then they could be thrown out. So this is a retention period that has a contingency. If you get an audit, after the audit, the records can be destroyed. If you don't have the audit, basically they've got 6 years to do the audit, after which you no longer need to keep them. Okay, that's an example of what we talk about. We talk about a record schedule and records retention period. You'll notice it's very, very specific. There's not a lot of interpretation on that one. So now that we talked about some of the basic definitions of some of our key ingredients, let's talk about the process itself of creating the file plan. First step is to determine the scope. Now, if you're in an office where you have been assigned as the records person for an office, and your boss is saying, I want you to create, I want you to help us get our files in order, you want to determine the scope of your file plan. Should your file plan be for all the records in your office, or should it be the records of a division? Should it be the records of an entire, agency? Most organizations, when you do a file plan, it'll be basically for an office area. You also want to determine, whether you want to cover the electronic records in your file plan, or maybe start off with just your paper records. My advice to you as someone who has done records management a long, long time is perhaps if you are new to records management and you want to create a file plan for your office, my suggestion would be start off with a file plan of your paper documents first, and once you're comfortable with that, and once it's been approved, once you've gone through the whole process, at that point, consider doing that electronic records file plan. Okay? So we want it to be a reasonable scope. We don't want this to be a project that's going to take you years and years to do. We want it to be a fairly quick win for you. So again, scope is very important. Second bullet, also very important. We want to establish the support. Okay. A lot of what we do in records management is very much dependent upon management support. As the records manager for an organization, we are going to be helping our fellow employees to comply with the federal requirements. Hopefully by now you have a sense that, when I talk about federal requirements, these are requirements that are set at a higher level, whether they be at your agency headquarters or whether they be at National Archives. We want to help our individual workers, the people that we work with every day, help them to comply. We're not making the rules, but we're helping them to comply with the rules. Okay? Part of that requires that we get management support. We want to make sure that the boss is behind the file plan, the boss recognizes the need for the file plan, and most importantly, the boss is going to support your efforts to get people to comply with the file plan. Support is very important. That is true in any of our records management endeavors. Support is very important to receive that. Third bullet, very important, we basically need to inventory the records. If you're coming into the office for the first time, perhaps you're new to the job, you've been assigned as a collateral duty to be the records manager for your organization, one of the first things you want to do, even before you think about the file plan, is to do a records inventory. By that I mean you literally are going to get an inventory, a listing of all the record types, all of the record series, as we talked about before, all of those record series that your office creates. What types of records do you create? Where are they physically located? What are the dates? What are the quantities? All of this basic information about the records that you create and maintain. Okay? So a records inventory is something that we want to do very early on. Let me give you the Reader's Digest version of the process here of creating a file plan. Once you've done your records inventory, you will then go look at the retention schedule. You'll match up your inventory information, that is to say, what records does my office have? I will match up that inventory information with the retention schedule. I will go to the retention schedule. I will find the records that I identified in my inventory. I will match them up to the guidance from the retention schedule. I'll put both of that both of those pieces of information together, and I've got my file plan. Okay. Again, we want to use consensus as much as possible because we want people to be able to live with what we come up with. And so people may have ideas how they want the file plan to look. I think it's a cute little drawing there of a file plan with legs. The important point of this, too, is that a file plan is something that it's a living document over time. And again, this is true for most things that we do in records management. Our records keeping practices will change over time. Our office gets a new function. All of a sudden we have more responsibilities than we had last time. We are creating new records that we did not create before. We want to make sure that our file plan will capture that. Sometimes we no longer have certain functions that we used to. We want to make sure that our file plan those items are removed from our file plan. Our file plan should basically give us a snapshot of all the records that we have and give us the retention guidance on how long to keep them. So it's a living document. And I do have a slide at the end where we talk about updating your file plan. So let's talk really quickly about what a record series inventory is. We offer classes. The National Archives and Records Administration offers a lot of classes in this very topic, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. We will probably have a session similar to this one, just on the topic of records inventory itself. I kind of covered it a little bit before already. Again, a first step as the new records manager for an organization, or if your organization is new, is to do a records inventory. Find out what records you create and maintain, and the dates, locations, all of that kind of thing. Okay. When we do our records inventory, just like when we talked about file plans, define the scope ahead of time. Is the inventory going to be just for the records in our office areas? Is the inventory going to include records that we might have stored in a records center somewhere? The National Archives and Records Administration, if you didn't know, has a series of federal record centers. Perhaps your office is already sending records to those federal record centers. When I would do my records inventory, as part of the records inventory, I would find out what records we were storing in those record centers. So scope, very important. The inventory may also include your electronic records. Again, my advice to you, if you are new to records management, let's tackle the paper records first and then talk about the electronic. If you're ambitious or if you've got some experience with the records inventory, at that point, let's talk about doing that electronic records inventory. Okay. So that's the scope, determining which records to include, the ones that are high volume or high importance, perhaps, triage it that way. We are going to conduct that inventory by the record series or record type, okay? Contracts, vouchers, and so on. We may identify some records that do not appear on the record schedule as part of our inventory. You may run across that. At that point, then there's a process of getting them on a schedule. We won't cover that today, but it's something you want to look for, some records that you can't find on the schedule. And we may also include the electronic records, okay, in the records inventory. Very important first step, and again, we do offer a lot of training on doing a records inventory. So I'd recommend to you, when we talk at the end about other resources, you may want to consider taking some NARA training on records inventory. Very important early step in the process. Next question, what should my file plan look like? What information should be on my file plan? Good news for some of you work for agencies, that a lot of the file plan work has already been done for you. They actually have already developed file plans for you. All you need to do is go to your records management officer. Usually it's on the intranet site. They will post file plans or models for file plans. A lot of the work might be done for you already, in which case we saved you a lot of steps. If you're creating one from scratch basically for your office needs, these are the types of things that you may want to add. A number or a file code. Those of you who work with files on a regular basis know that many agencies, there's been a file code associated with that type of file. I think we should include that. If that does exist, we should include that in your file plan because we want people to use that file code. The record series title. What type of record is it? Give it a title. Give it a description. You saw the example of the time and attendance records on that schedule sample I showed you earlier. Good example of a record series title and a record series description. You may want to give some filing instructions, where you might say file these alphabetically, or file them by contract number, or file them by date of closure, or whatever. That's an optional thing. You may want to include that. Again, whatever works best for you to help ensure staff compliance. That's what we're really after. So if you want to include file instructions, include file instructions. Retention is definitely a mandatory. You want to include the retention information. Again, you're taking it off the retention schedule and it's copying it over to the file plan. You're not making up a retention on your own. You're following the existing guidance. Okay. Disposition instructions and authority. Basically, this might be a way of indicating, the fact that you have done your research, that you've looked at the NOAA schedule or the U.S. Marshal Service schedule or the TSA schedule, and you're matching it up to that retention schedule. Indicate the disposition authority on your file plan. You may do that. It's an optional thing to do. If records are of a confidential nature, you may want to indicate that as well. These are some examples of things that you might want to include. I'm going to show you now an example of a file plan worksheet. This is an optional sheet. You don't have to use it. It basically covers the items that we were just talking about. Where this comes in handy, if you're thinking of developing a file plan and you want to get the pieces that you need in order to develop that file plan, you may want to just fill this thing out. Include an item number perhaps, or an inventory item number, perhaps suggest the file code, there's a description, the retention. All of those things I was talking about are on a form similar to this. So again, this might be something you might want to consider using for your purposes when you do a file plan. Next, I want to talk about file code. And as I mentioned before, your agency may have already given you these. You may already have them. In fact, the odds are pretty good you already do have file codes. If you work, for example, with the Forest Service, basically, I know TSA, most federal agencies do have file codes that they want you to use. It's usually a number, or it could be a combination of letters and numbers. You see some examples there. So, for example, you might see perhaps your agency wants you to use ADMI 820 as visitor control files, or BU 1116 as full-time employee FTE planning, or whatever. They may provide you with a file plan number that you want to use. That'll be shown, that's normally shown on the retention schedule. When you go to the retention schedule for those items, normally it'll indicate the file code at that point. You want to make, if you're going to transpose it onto the file plan, which is a good idea, you may also have subcategories within that number. And so if you're creating a subcategories, you want that number to be extensible. So perhaps under ADMI 820 visitor control files, you may have an A and a B. Internal visitors versus external visitors, maybe internal would be 820A, external visitors would be 820B, or whatever. That's what we mean by extensible. Okay? So it's using the existing higher level file code, it's adding some subcategories to it. That's the kind of thing that we're looking for on the file plan. And I'll show you an example in just a couple of minutes of what that's going to look like. File code is very important. And again, we're continuing to look at examples of what should be on a file plan. Next thing, of course, is the record series title. We talked about that before. For me, normally I'll just copy more or less the terminology I see in the retention schedule, perhaps paraphrase a bit. I will also looking at that second bullet, I will also look for commonly used terms. If we have a colloquial name for a file in our office, I will look for that, and I may include that in the file plan. That's perfectly okay to do, because if people use a different name for it in the office, we want them to be able to find that type of record. So use that colloquial name, also known as, and put the term that you use. The title should be descriptive and reasonably short. Again, here's a description, which also should be on the file plan. Again, we're reviewing the contents of a file plan. adapt that from the records series description, include some sub-items, make it meaningful. And again, if there are colloquial ways of talking about those files in the office, this is a place to indicate too, also known as, and what it's used for. Okay. So you've got some flexibility. Hopefully the message that I'm giving you here is that when you create the file plan, you do have some guidance from your headquarters. You may have file codes that they want you to use already. That's great. Use them. For sure you want to use the retention guidelines. Don't deviate from those retention guidelines. If it says 6 years, put 6 years on the file plan. But even though you have this agency guidance, you also have some room for creativity locally. So if you do have a special name for a file that you call it locally, add that in the description. There's no reason why you can't do that. NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, does not govern how we want your file plans to look. The next item you want to have on your file plan, and again, I'll show you some examples of what these actually look like. How do you name and categorize the records for filing instructions? Are there folder naming conventions? You put file codes on the file folders. File them alphabetically, file them by contract number or whatever. We want to indicate that on the file plan. It could be simple as indicating on the file plan, file by contract numbers. Or remove all closed case files, file in closed case files, or whatever. Very specific filing instructions. You've got the ability to put that in the file plan. Electronic records, naming conventions. Again, we offer training specifically on electronic records management. Naming conventions are important for electronic records, just as was true for electronic. I would argue actually almost more so important that we use standard naming conventions for our electronic records. Where are the files physically going to be located? Are they in paper filing systems? Are they in centralized files? Are they at people's desks? Are they down in some basement storage area? Hopefully not, but are they in some kind of basement storage area? Are they at the federal record centers? Where should they be physically located? In the electronic environment, what servers are they on? That will change over time, but the concept is you want to make sure that we know where these records reside. And again, we covered this already. The concept of the retention period is given to you by the retention schedule. You don't have to make it up. It's already there. You should follow the retention schedule item for that one. You should definitely do not keep the records shorter than the retention period. I would actually argue that you should try to, as best as possible, follow what the retention period says. What we try to do in records management is create, use, and destroy our records as part of a normal business process, as part of a standardized process. That's why we want to follow those retention guidelines that we get from our headquarters. And I think it's helpful to cite the retention authority on your file plan. This way, everybody knows where that retention period comes from. They know that it's your official agency policy, and so on. But I think it's useful to cite the authority. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like in just a minute. So again, these are items that we want on the file plan. Next item is cutoff. On your file plan, you want to indicate when records should be cut off. If you have a contract file, when the contract expires perhaps. If you have permit files, perhaps a land use permit file or something like that. Once that permit expires or the permit is denied or whatever, the examples you see on the screen, patient dies in the case of a hospital environment. Well, that's an example of a cutoff in a sense. When an employee separates, when they retire, their personnel file, there's a cutoff for that. What we want to do, and not to make you an expert on cutoffs at this stage, but what we want to do is indicate on our file plan what the cutoff is. Because again, the purpose of the file plan is to give our fellow employees guidance so that they can comply with the legal requirements. It will be helpful to them if you indicate on the file plan when the record should be cut off. Okay. Disposition authority. I think you pretty much covered it already. And again, the concept is that we want to be able to show, everybody what the retention should be, when the records should be cut off. Should they be sent to the federal record centers? Again, as I mentioned before, the National Archives and Records Administration has a network of federal record centers throughout the country. So depending upon where you are, You may currently or in the future might use Federal Record Centers. The file plan could very easily indicate transfer to the Federal Record Center in Fort Worth, in Atlanta, in Seattle, wherever you might be, after a certain period of time. So certainly indicate that onto the file plan. You don't have to, but I think it's handy to have. This next bullet, though, is fairly important. Privacy and security considerations. I think you probably know, if you work in an office that deals with a lot of private security type information, PII information, information that should not be compromised, it's a good idea to indicate on file plans whether there's private information involved and what extra steps might need to be taken when it comes time for transferring and disposition. The second major bullet on the disposition instructions, after the retention period expires, when is the record eligible for destruction? When are they eligible? How is it authorized based upon the retention schedule? And also, internal approval for that disposal of records. Does the unit manager need to sign off on the disposal? We can indicate that on the retention, on the file plan rather. And if the record is an archival, permanent, or historical record, you may have those as well. These are records that are going to be preserved in the National Archives for future generations. If you are creating those records, we want to indicate on the file plan that these are permanent. The term that we use, archival records. Indicate that these are archival records and the point at which they should be transferred to NARA. The retention schedule for your agency is very specific if something is archival or not. So you'll know by looking at the retention schedule. But we'll want to indicate that on the file plan. I think the other reason to indicate on the file plan if something is archival or permanent is that if people realize that these records are going to be in the archives at some point, they'll take better care of them while they're still in your agency custody. You basically have flagged these as being historical, and people take better care of those records. I'm going to show you a couple of examples now of what a file plan might look like, because I think the examples are worth a lot more than just my telling you about it. The first one, sample file plan, is from again, this is fictitious. You'll see the note here. Do not implement. Use as a sample only. Use it as a sample only. So do not use this. You may want to follow the format, but this is not an actual file plan. So please do not use this for your office. I just want to show it to you as an example of what a file plan might look like. So you see for this first example for reading files. There's a file code, 140, a series title, reading files, a description of the records, subject arranged files with briefing papers, etc. Filing arrangement or instructions, filed by subject or topic, and then a final disposition. You're going to review the file annually. You're going to destroy the material when 5 years older or no longer of reference value, whichever comes first. And then you'll see a citation. On this example, it says NWS 71. That's a reference to a retention schedule. Okay. So again, this is what a file plan might look at. This is one way it might look. Sort of in a list format. I would expect that this will only be like a 1 or 2 page document altogether. This says 1 to 10, but there's really only 4 pages in this document. You want it to be a short document. We want the file plan to have only the records that are related to your office. We want it to be a relatively short document. This is one format that the file plan might take shape. The other example of another format of file plan, you notice how we have it in columns. I personally prefer this style of file plan to the one I just showed you previously. It has the same information. Look at this. The information is pretty much the same. You've got the file codes on the left-hand side. You've got the series title, and we can put more of a description if you wanted to in that second column, budget and finance policy files. You see your disposition instructions, very specific disposition instructions. It indicates the location where the records are located or should be located, the main file station. We didn't talk about this, but something you may want to consider. If the records are if they are vital records, if they would be needed in the event of an emergency, you could maybe indicate that by a check mark. Or if they're Privacy Act records that are of a private nature that you don't want released to the public, we can indicate that there as well. Okay. I like this format primarily because it's much easier to follow. It's easier to read. It's very easy to summarize the information that people need to have. Very visual. So when I personally create file plans, they tend to look more like this one, but it really depends upon the culture of your organization, what format you want them to take. So those are two examples. And again, I want to remind you, they're just samples. Please do not use them for your office verbatim. I really do. I do like that example, the second example particularly, to show you. Next thing I want to cover really, really quickly, and again, the point of this is not to make you an expert in electronic records management. That's something that we cannot cover in a half-hour presentation. We have a lot of classes that the National Archives produces on that. But we talked about electronic records management. I already mentioned the fact that a file plan could be used for your electronic records, that you should use a file plan for your electronic records management. Many of the things that we talked about earlier when it comes to the file codes, arrangements, and so on is just as true in the electronic age. And so you see this example here where you've got records that are on a local area network, on a server somewhere. And you'll see the categories here: outreach, correspondence. You see the subcategories within each of those. Okay? So your file plan may also include how you set up your shared drive files in your directories, on your servers. So again, there's no magic about it. You're just taking the information. How are you currently storing records electronically, just like you did with the paper records? How you're storing them electronically? What categories are we using? Getting that consensus of what terminology are we going to use? What categories are we going to use? That's what we're going to use for our guidance. And the other example here, you see some file naming conventions. And again, it's going to depend on your organization. For example, you see those three down below: spotted owl, a date, litigation. So that's obviously litigation files, followed by the docx suffix. Portland, new directors, whatever. The idea is when we talk about consensus building, get that consensus. How are we going to name our electronic files? Just like we got consensus on how we're going to name our paper files, that's what we want to capture in our electronic file plan. My suggestion is, if you are new to the game of records management, this is good information to have. I would concentrate on my paper documents, do the file plan for the paper documents. When you're ready to take on the electronic files that you create, I think you're going to be much more comfortable having got the first one under your belt. And again, I always recommend you contact us for more information about how to go about this, and also check with your agency headquarters records managers as well. So let me recap what we've covered so far. We covered what a file plan is. We covered what information can be on the file plan. Okay. Hopefully you got the message that some information that's on the file plan you're just going to pull from other sources. Some of the information on the file plan you're going to create, being creative, using local conventions. Okay. We talked about electronic records as well. Let's finish up talking about file plan use and maintenance. And it's important that we keep our file plans up to date. Again, as I mentioned, everything that we do in records management is going to change over time. Our functions of the organization change. These things will change over time. We want our file plan to represent our current situation. Okay? So we want to make sure that we've got this responsibility for keeping the file plan up to date. We want to make sure that whenever the retention schedule changes come about, maybe a retention period has changed. Perhaps a record that was a 5-year record is now a 10-year record. I'm hopeful that when this happens in your agency, that there is a mechanism for you to be notified for a change in the retention schedules. If not, if you don't receive notification about retention schedule changes, I would recommend that you periodically review. And normally it's just a matter of going to your intranet site, because most agencies post their retention schedules on their intranet site. Go to your headquarters records management program pages. Match up the retention schedules. Just make sure there haven't been any changes to them, because we want to reflect those changes. So if the retention period has gone from 5 years to 10 years, we don't want our file plan to say 5 years anymore. So make sure that that represents accuracy. There might be some work process changes. Perhaps a different office now handles a certain type of record, and therefore it can be taken off your file plan, added to somebody else's. Perhaps the media type has changed. Paper, electronic. In this modern world, we have all sorts of records that we're creating in all sorts of different formats. Who knows 10 years from now, when you're listening to this presentation, what format you're going to be using. That can impact your file plan. And you want to make sure you're adding record series as needed or desired. As things change, as we talked about earlier, make sure the file plan represents that. Hopefully this has been a helpful introduction to file plans for you. For additional information, and again, these URLs may change over time, but basically our records management at the National Archives and Records Administration, you see the URL listed above. NARA.learn.com is our current learning management system for taking further training. If you've got an interest in taking classes on file plans or records inventory or any other records management related topic, that's a good site to go to. Archives.gov Records Management General Records Schedule. I talked about the General Records Schedule. Other additional resources, for more information about the inventory worksheet and the samples that I showed you, contact us for that. And then also, contact your agency records management officer first, perhaps, and then depending where you physically are located. If you're located in Kansas City, there's a NARA records office in Kansas City, Atlanta, Fort Worth, Seattle, various California cities or whatever. Find out who your local NARA person is as well. Overall, though, and this URL is not going to change over time. So if you're listening to this presentation 10 years from today, this will still be the same. www.archives.gov is a good place to go for more information about NARA and federal records management. www.archives.gov. I want to thank you again for your attention during this presentation. And again, keep tuned. We'll have additional subjects that we'll talk about in this format, other records management related topics. And again, feel free to contact us at any point at archives.gov. Find out who your agency records contact is. And best of all, benchmark with your colleagues. If you know people in your offices who've done file plans, work with them. Find out how they've done them in the past. No need to recreate the wheel. With that, I'll call the presentation over. Thank you.
We hope you found this seminar useful. For more information about the U.S. National Archives and Records Administration and its National Records Management Training Program, please visit us online at archives.gov or view our current schedule of face-to-face and online workshops at nara.learn.com.